We often seek after wisdom or wise instruction given by men of God in the Scripture that gives us direction on how to walk before the Lord. Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Friday. You know, David was just that type of person who had learned a lot from following God. Maybe he had learned some things from his own mistakes when he wasn't following the Lord. But he writes in 1 Kings 2, giving some sage advice to his son Solomon, who would succeed him as the next king. In 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 3, he says, "And keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn." Solomon was called to keep the charge of the Lord his God. Now, David is about to go the way of all the earth, he says. He knew he wouldn't be around to guide his son in serving as the king. Perhaps the new king had received a special charge in leading God's people, Israel. But David's real advice is to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments. You know, even a king needed to follow his will and his way for the Lord in his life in order to be successful. He was not above these commandments and these statutes that God had handed down to guide our lives. Oh, and by the way, neither are we exempt from any of those statutes. We're not exempt from following God's way for our daily lives either. These judgments, these testimonies, they were well known to the Jewish people. Unfortunately, Solomon had received all the laws and the warnings not to stray from them, but he later took wives that were from foreign countries. They brought their own gods to worship in Israel. Solomon saw everything under the sun to seek to satisfy his lust, but he tells us it was all empty. He should have learned from his father and from the statutes that were given from Moses on how to walk in obedience and with a close relationship with God. You see, God's judgments and testimonies gave him warnings about how many had turned from God in the past and they had suffered the consequences. You would think he would have those statutes and commandments read to him regularly so he would map out his life and live in submission and obedience to God. That would be the only way he could lead Israel with all the wisdom that God had given him. But Solomon got distracted. He was distracted with his own ventures toward riches and fame and fortune. Now, before we judge Solomon too harshly, we need to look into our own hearts and our own minds. Ask the question, is this world drawing me away from the statutes that I know God has given me in his word? I mean, these commandments were given so many years ago to Moses for God's people. It's not like this is a new thing that we really don't understand or we've never heard before. But all too often, we either don't think these rules apply to us, or maybe we think that we can stray without the judgment of God in our lives. You know, David's charge was for him to keep these commandments so that he would prosper in all he sought to do. And Solomon did prosper in worldly things, in riches. David wanted him to prosper wherever he would turn, but unfortunately, Solomon turned away from God later in life. Are we allowing something in our life today to turn us from the statutes and the judgments that we know are so important in our life? Or will we take this charge that David gives to follow God in all his commandments that we might prosper in our lives on all that we do and wherever we turn?